Probably because I'm getting older. I've been thinking about this a lot. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to a video in which I'm going to talk about how I believe that reading changed my life. Now, there are some basic things I think it's important for anybody to understand about reading and its importance. To me, reading is like, and this is not original, of course, it's a cliche, reading is like working out for your brain. Just as people, today devote themselves to issues of physical fitness, and they work out and they lift weights and they go running and they walk and they do, all these kinds of exercise classes to build up their bodies, which is all great, and all things I think, to a certain extent, we should all try to do more of. One of the things that I think that a lot of people overlook is doing the same thing for your brain. And obviously, I think reading is the best way to do this. I can't think of a better way to enrich your life, to enrich your relationships, to enrich your own mind, your own interior world than reading. Because reading opens us up to, a whole world of experiences that we are never going to have. It puts us in a whole lot of places that we are never going to go. It introduces us to a whole lot of people that we'll never meet, that we'll never interact with, but we get to do that in books. And just as traveling to other places enriches your life, and I think most people understand how that works. Just as meeting lots of people and meeting lots of different kinds of people is an eye-opening educational experience. In the same way, then reading is that experience. And I really wish that we weren't looking at what apparently is a decline in reading in the United States of America. One of the things that as an old man terrifies me about AI is that AI is just going to take the place of our own creative thinking, that AI will replace, at least people will believe it replaces their need to think and have these thoughts and to have these interior worlds because they can just, apparently, or seem to create them out of nothing using these programs. That worries me because I think that kind of death of creativity, not creativity just on the part of people who would consider themselves to be artists, not just painters or sculptors or writers or poets or whatever, or actors, not just in that way, but just the everyday experience of living and creating and the joy that can bring. I think, I worry about that going away, and I think, again, the antidote to that is reading. I think a lot of people who are not readers right now are intimidated by the idea of reading. And I'm just going to tell you, there's no reason to feel that way. One of the great things about BookTube is it's a resource for all kinds of books. And you can find people who read all kinds of books of various lengths and seriousness and literary quality and all kinds of other things right here on BookTube. And you can find something that you're interested in. You don't have to pick up Moby Dick and try to read it to become a reader. You can pick up any book and read it and become a reader. There's no set number of books you have to read to be a reader. One book a year is, really right around what the average American says they read. So, I think that qualifies you as a reader. And it doesn't really matter to me what that book is. Now, obviously, I have favorites. I have opinions about books and which books are better and which books are not as good or which books maybe, in a highfalutin way are more valuable to read than others. But none of that matters. That's my opinion. What you choose to read should be something that appeals to you, should be something that interests you. And those books are out there. Those books are out there for men and women and non-binary people. Those books exist, and you can find them, and you can read them. And, I think what a lot of people do is they start reading about their own experiences. And then what I would hope they do is they start reading about the experiences of people who are very much different from them. And that, I think, is life-altering in the sense that it opens your mind to all kinds of ideas. It literally forces you to be open-minded, to, accept that these people that you're reading about, even though they're fictional characters, they're based on people, or they represent people who actually exist. And one of the things I think that books do is they create that kind of common sense of humanity. You can recognize yourself. Matter of fact, the most profound reading experiences I've ever had have been recognizing myself or things that I've experienced in characters that are not like me at all. And I think that is an incredibly enriching, brain-building, life-boosting quality or aspect of reading that I wish more people would indulge in, even if it's just one book a year. Even if it's, half a book of short stories, it doesn't matter. The experience is the same. And if you keep at it long enough, even if it's one book a year, even if it's 3 short stories a year, keep at it long enough, you're going to read something that I think clicks with you. You're going to read something which makes you want to read something else. And at that point, you have become a reader, and you're going to have what I would think of, or what I would refer to as the reader's high. There's this long cliche about runners having a runner's high, and at a certain point, they stop feeling the pain and they just, enjoy the run. And it's a euphoric experience. That happens with me reading from time to time, where I'm reading along and I get so swept up in what I'm reading that I don't notice myself turning the pages. And for once in my life, I'm not paying attention to the page number, and I'm not thinking about how many pages are left. I'm just experiencing this kind of euphoria of reading. And I think if people would read enough, would try to read a little bit, they would find that this would happen for them, and that they just have to find what they want to read. So to kind of give an illustration of how I think this works, I want to talk about the history of my reading life by talking about 5 books that I think were really important in shaping me as a reader and moving me from one stage of reading to another. So, not surprisingly, for somebody who is 58, which means I grew up in the 70s and I went to high school in the 80s, not surprisingly for somebody my age, the book or the series of books, or the one big book that really, I think, started me on the path to reading is Lord of the Rings. That's not an uncommon thing among people my age. For nerds my age in the 70s and 80s, Lord of the Rings was kind of, I think, had the same impact that a generation ago, Harry Potter had, and that it kind of hooked them on reading. And this was true for me for Lord of the Rings. Now, I will say that I grew up in a middle-class home with 2 parents who stayed together, who fought irregularly. There was no substance abuse, and while we were never rich, we were never actually in poverty. So I led an incredibly privileged life as a child, and yet, as a teenager, what I found in the Lord of the Rings was comfort. A world I could escape to from, the teenage problems, the real problems, my concerns about problems in the world. Been a political person my whole life, as far as I know, and Lord of the Rings gave me another place to go. And so, as I've said many times in my channel, in my videos, what I do with Lord of the Rings is I just read the books over and over again. I would get to the end of the Return of the King, and I would go right back to the Fellowship of the Ring, right back to the beginning part of the Fellowship of the Ring, and just read the books through over and over again, so that I would always have this escape. And so, I think that stage of my reading was me reading to escape. Whatever problems I thought I had, no matter how unserious they might have been, I was reading to escape. And of course, from Tolkien, I went to Terry Brooks and a couple of J.R.R. books, David Eddings, The Belgariad. I went to Stephen R. Donaldson and the Thomas Covenant Chronicles. And I read those books for the same reason and in the same way. And the more I read them, the more comfort I got from reading them, because, while it's great to not know what's going to happen in a book, it can also be great to know. It can be comforting to know what's going to happen. I think this is part of the pleasure of rereading, and part of the reason why Lord of the Rings was so important to me. So when I went to college, all I'd really read in high school, beyond what I was assigned to read, all I'd really read in high school was fantasy. I got to college and I met somebody who became my best friend for a while, and he wanted to be a writer. And he read lots of things, but the thing that he kind of introduced me to was reading kind of 1920s, 30s classic American literature. And in particular, this led me to Hemingway. So the second book, which, really shaped me as a reader, was The Sun Also Rises. This is the first Hemingway novel I read, and it really hooked me on Hemingway. As I've said many times, a young cis-het white man in the 1980s reading about the bohemian lifestyle in Paris and all the things that went on just really appealed to me, and that whole expatriate experience appealed to me. And so I read Hemingway in college. From Hemingway, of course, I read Fitzgerald. From Fitzgerald and Hemingway, I read Faulkner. And so I really immersed myself in these classics of American literature from like the early to maybe mid 20th century. That became what I read. And I wanted to read all of those books by all of those authors, with the exception of a few stories by Hemingway and some novels by Faulkner, which don't really appeal to me all that much. I did. But in the process of doing this, I created this idea in my head that these books appealed to me because they were by people like me, cis-het white men, and about people like me, primarily cis-het white men. And therefore, for whatever reason, I got this wrong-headed idea that that's what I should read. That, I was more comfortable reading books by cis-het white men, and therefore those are the books that I should read. Those are the books that spoke to me. And I had this naive, ridiculous idea that, it was perfectly all right for me to read in a limited way, and it is, to read in this limited way because these were books written for me by people like me. Now, I think that's a wrong-headed idea, and the next book on my list really helped break me free of that idea, and that book is Beloved by Toni Morrison. So, I don't remember exactly when I became aware of Beloved. Before the movie came out and before the whole Oprah situation with Beloved came out, I was aware of the book. And I talked to this friend of mine from college who's a great person and reads widely. And he wasn't interested in Beloved because he thought essentially it would tell a story very similar to the ones that were told in Faulkner. But I read the book and it was revelatory to me because here's this story about an enslaved black woman who essentially murders one of her children to avoid that child being caught, her and that child being caught and sent back into slavery, this kind of nightmarish plantation where she lived, and had experiences in a time period and a gender and experience of being a mother that I would never have. But I became so engrossed in Setha's story and the experiences she was having that in that scene out in the woods where she goes to confront Beloved, my heart was pounding and I felt like I was in that scene. And for the first time, I was reading a book about somebody who was very different from me, who I would never be like, and yet who was, I was identifying with, and that, I understood, and that I felt this connection to. And from that was really the first kind of chink in this wall I built up about this idea that I should only read books by people like me because they were written for me and therefore spoke to me. And Beloved began the process of changing that. And so, that process really is a process of reading, a stage of reading I've been on, ever since then, which was really only sped up by BookTube. But another, stage of my reading, which is kind of similar to, I guess, this idea of reading the American classics, was just reading classic works of literature. I don't know what was going on in the school district where I lived and where I grew up, but they didn't assign classic works of literature. We weren't assigned to read J.R.R. or Wuthering Heights or, the works of Jane Austen. We weren't assigned to read those books. We weren't assigned very many novels at all, and the novels we were assigned had a tendency to be, a little bit more contemporary and, I don't think quite anywhere near the quality of those kind of classic books. So, I started teaching. I was a history teacher, and I had kind of a friendly rivalry with the English department at my school because it seemed to me that a lot of times the teachers who were teaching American literature were essentially teaching many of the same things I was teaching as an American history teacher, and oftentimes joked they all really wanted to be history teachers, but they just chose wrong and became English teachers. Well, that's not fair. Of course, I was just joking. But along the same lines, I oftentimes gave them a hard time about the reading list, which seemed to me, as this kind of I guess I would call myself a misogynist reader, that the reading list was too heavy on books by women. And so, I used to give them a hard time about reading, Jane Eyre and Pride and Prejudice and all those books that I didn't read in high school, having those on the reading list and how, unfair that was because those books only spoke to, girls and women. And then, I read Pride and Prejudice. And so Pride and Prejudice is the fourth book that really changed me as a reader and as a person. Because I went into Pride and Prejudice fully expecting to be bored by Pride and Prejudice. I wasn't bored for a single minute. The writing, the characterization, the wit, the humor, all the things that we think about with Pride and Prejudice, all the things that are among Jane Austen's amazing gifts as a writer were clear to me as soon as I started reading the book. And I became engrossed in the book, and I thought, I've been wrong. So one of the things that I would say about Pride and Prejudice is that it convinced me that I'd been wrong, and therefore it kind of contributed to this idea that, my reading, which had been really narrow, but, fairly deep in that kind of one slot, wasn't really serving me well, and that, waiting for a book to come out written by a cishet white man that I thought was, a serious enough piece of literature for me to read, was wrong-headed, and that I needed to branch out and do more. A few years after that, well, many years after that, as I kind of slowly began to expand my reading scope, I decided to join BookTube, I believe in 2019. And that automatically opened me up to a whole new world of books, books in translation, books by authors from India and Korea and Japan and various countries in Africa, South Africa, Nigeria, and, all these places that I was reading books from. And I'd already kind of begun reading books from South America, at least in books by men from South America like Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But BookTube really kind of expanded my idea of reading. And one area where I'd done very little reading was reading books by and about LGBTQ plus characters. And so one of the things I did when I joined BookTube is I really kind of got into Pride Month reading as a way of expanding my reading experiences because, as I said, Beloved and Pride and Prejudice had proved to me that many of my ideas about reading were wrong. And so I wanted to read more widely in this area as well. And so I began reading, LGBTQ plus books every June. And then slowly I found that I was reading books by members of the LGBTQ plus community outside of June. And so the last book on my list, I think really I want to say is a book that changed me is Boulder. Because that is one of the books in which I felt the deepest, most immediate connection and understanding with a character ever. The main character is a woman who's known as Boulder. She essentially had tried to live her life isolated from other people. She falls in love with a woman, and they move to Iceland, where her wife decides that she wants to have a baby, and Boulder is really uncomfortable with this idea. And this spoke to me. Boulder is an introvert, a lesbian living in Iceland who used to work on a fishing boat off the coast of Chile. None of that is me. And yet, her worry about this child and how it would change things, and her, absolute love for her wife, and, her interior experiences really spoke to me. And it kind of, I think, further convinced me that there is no type of book that you can't find connection with, that this kind of human connection can be made across, all the divisions which we think divide us as people, all the categories in which we divide ourselves into or allowed ourselves to be divided into, and all the kind of silly ideas we have about, and that I had about, books that are written for us and books that are not written for us. Books are written for everybody, and you can read all of them. Even books that authors really didn't write for you, you can read and get something out of. And so, that to me is how reading has changed my life. And I think it's made that change for the better. And so I feel like a better person who's grown a lot since I started reading, and grown because I started reading, and who I hope I will continue to grow because of reading. Anyway, there you go. That's how reading changed my life. If you have any other experiences or want to make your own video of this, please feel free to do that. I look forward to your comments in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.